We had been planning this camping trip for weeks. Me, Jason, and Sarah wanted to get away from the city for a while. Just relax, make some s'mores, and sleep under the stars. We found this spot online, deep in the woods, far from everything. It sounded perfect. It was called Miller's Creek. The reviews were mixed. Some people said it was peaceful. Others, well, they said it felt off. But we just brushed it off. Ghost stories are everywhere, right? We got there late in the afternoon. The trees were tall, blocking most of the sunlight, and the air was cool, even though it was summer. Jason joked about it being the perfect place for a horror movie. "Dude, imagine a killer just lurking behind those trees," he laughed. Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're such an idiot," she said, but I could tell she was a little uneasy. Honestly, I was too, but I didn't say anything. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and by the time the sun was setting, the fire was crackling, and we were all just chilling. That's when things started to feel wrong. It was subtle at first. You know how sometimes you feel like someone's watching you? That's how I felt. Every time I looked into the woods, I swore I saw shadows moving between the trees. But when I focused on one spot, there was nothing. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem paranoid. Jason was telling some dumb joke when Sarah suddenly said, "Did you hear that?" We all went quiet. There was this weird sound coming from deeper in the woods, like branches snapping, but not like an animal. It was slow, like someone deliberately stepping on them. Jason got up, grabbed a flashlight, and pointed it towards the trees. "Probably a deer," he said, though he didn't sound too sure. We tried to go back to our conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, and I knew she felt it too. That night, we tried to sleep, but none of us really could. The wind rustled the tent, and every little sound outside made me jump. At some point, I dozed off, but I swear I woke up to the sound of someone breathing right next to the tent. I froze, holding my breath, but eventually it stopped. I didn't tell the others. The next morning, Jason was gone. At first, we thought he had just gone to pee or something, but after 30 minutes of calling his name and searching around the camp, we started to panic. His stuff was still here, his sleeping bag, his backpack, even his shoes. Sarah was freaking out. He wouldn't just leave like this. She kept saying, "Where the hell is he?" We split up and searched the area, but there was no sign of him. Not even footprints. It was like he had just vanished. I tried to stay calm for Sarah's sake, but inside, I was losing it. What the hell was going on? We didn't have cell service, so calling for help wasn't an option. I told Sarah we should pack up and head back to the car, maybe find some help. But when we tried to leave the campsite, something weird happened. We couldn't find the trail. It didn't make sense. We hadn't walked far from the car, maybe a half mile, but every path we took just led us deeper into the woods. It was like the forest had changed overnight. After hours of walking, completely lost and growing more desperate with each step, we stumbled onto something that none of us expected to see out there in the middle of nowhere, a cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, and looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The wooden walls were warped and gray from years of weather exposure, and one of the windows was broken, with shards of glass glittering in the overgrown grass. It was eerie, but at that moment, it felt like a lifeline. "Maybe Jason's in there," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky, like she didn't even believe her own words. I didn't either. There was something off about the place, just like everything else about these woods. But we were exhausted, scared, and out of options. The sun was starting to set again, and we didn't have the luxury of being picky about where to take shelter. We couldn't keep wandering around in circles, not when it was getting dark. "We'll check it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe it's just a hunting cabin or something. If Jason found it, he might have gone inside." Sarah nodded, but I could tell by the way her eyes kept darting around the tree line that she was just as freaked out as I was. Something about this place felt wrong, but I wasn't about to say it out loud. We didn't have time to debate it. The closer we got to the cabin, the more unsettling it became. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, crooked and rotting at the bottom. There were strange markings carved into the wood around the door frame, symbols that didn't make any sense, like someone had scratched them in a hurry. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering just inches from the handle. My mind was screaming at me not to go inside, that we should turn around and run, but I pushed the feeling aside. Jason had to be in there. He had to be. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit us immediately. Damp wood, mildew, and something else that I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sharp. Blood? The inside of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from what little daylight still filtered through the broken window. The place was a mess. Old furniture was overturned, covered in dust and dirt. The floor was littered with debris, bits of broken glass, and what looked like animal bones. "Jason?" Sarah called out, her voice shaky. There was no response. I stepped further inside, careful not to make too much noise, though the floorboards creaked loudly under my weight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I scanned the room, but it was empty, at least empty of people. That's when Sarah found it. Jason's jacket. It was stuffed under a pile of old newspapers in the corner, torn and dirty. There were stains on it, dark reddish-brown stains that looked too much like blood to be anything else. My stomach dropped. There was no reason for his jacket to be here. No reason for it to be in this condition. "He was here," Sarah whispered, clutching the jacket in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Oh my God, he was here!" I grabbed her arm, trying to keep her calm. "We don't know that for sure," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Maybe he dropped it, maybe he's still out there. But deep down, I knew something terrible had happened. The jacket looked like it had been torn off him, like he had struggled, like something had taken him. Suddenly, there was a noise above us. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the ceiling. My blood turned to ice. There was someone or something upstairs. Sarah's eyes were wide with panic, and she grabbed my arm tighter. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I whispered back, my throat dry. "But we have to check." The thought of going up there was the last thing I wanted to do, but what choice did we have? If Jason was upstairs, we needed to know. If it wasn't him, well, I didn't want to think about that yet. We crept toward the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed, and I winced with every creak. The air up here was even staler, thick with dust, and the same metallic smell that had greeted us downstairs. My heart was pounding in my ears as we reached the top. There was a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The footsteps had stopped. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, and we both knew what had to happen next. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, but I could just make out a figure sitting on the floor, back turned to us. The person was wearing Jason's clothes, his torn jeans, his dirty flannel. Relief washed over me for a split second. "Jason," I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, my stomach twisting into knots. Something was wrong. "Jason," I said again, louder this time. The figure shifted, slowly turning its head toward us. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't Jason. It wasn't even human. The face that turned to look at us was pale. Too pale, like it had never seen sunlight. Its eyes were black, empty, and its mouth was twisted into something that looked like a smile, but wasn't. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, frozen in place as I stared at the thing wearing my friend's clothes. It stood up, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was in no rush. "We need to go," Sarah whispered urgently, yanking on my arm. I snapped out of it, and we bolted. We didn't stop until we were out of the cabin, running blindly through the woods, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. I didn't know what we had just seen, but one thing was clear. Jason was gone, and whatever was in that cabin wasn't him. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the cabin, lungs burning, legs aching, and still no clue where we were. The trees around us blurred together as the shadows of dusk crept in, and I couldn't tell how much time had passed since we bolted from the thing that wore Jason's clothes. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, had to get as far away from that place as possible. The air was thick, every breath feeling like it scraped the back of my throat, but we couldn't stop. Not yet. When we finally slowed down, Sarah collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. I dropped to my knees beside her, hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The silence of the forest was deafening now. No sound of animals, no wind, just the echo of our ragged breathing. For a moment, it felt like the woods themselves were listening, waiting. What the hell was that? Sarah panted between breaths, her eyes wide and filled with fear. I didn't have an answer. My brain was still trying to process what I had seen back in that cabin. Something that looked like Jason, but clearly wasn't him. I could still see its eyes, dark and hollow, staring back at us like it was amused by our terror. It moved like it wasn't used to having a body, like it was pretending to be human, but didn't quite understand how. I don't know, I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. But it wasn't Jason. Whatever it was, it had his clothes, but that wasn't him. Sarah pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back tears. Then where is he? What happened to him? Her voice cracked as she spoke, her fear boiling over into frustration. We have to go back. Maybe there's something we missed. Maybe he's still there. I shook my head, fear clawing at my insides. We can't go back there, Sarah. Whatever that thing was, it's not safe. Jason's gone. The words felt wrong as they left my mouth, but I knew they were true. Deep down, I'd known since the moment we found his jacket in that cabin. Jason wasn't coming back. We need to find a way out of here. Sarah looked at me, her face pale, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that there was nothing back at that cabin but danger. The problem was, we still had no idea where we were or how to get out of these woods. The trail had disappeared on us before, and it felt like the entire forest had shifted around us since we arrived. None of it made any sense. We need to find a car, I said, more to myself than to Sarah. If we could just make it back to the car, we could get out of this nightmare. We go straight to the police, tell them everything, and hope they believed us. At this point, that was our only option. But as we started moving again, that gnawing feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It felt like eyes were on us from every direction, just out of sight, hiding in the shadows of the trees. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump into my throat. Sarah must have felt it too, because she kept looking over her shoulder every few seconds, her hands clenched into fists. "What if it's following us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps on the dry leaves. "I don't know," I admitted, the fear creeping into my voice despite trying to stay calm. "But we can't stop." We walked in silence for what felt like hours, our surroundings blurring together in the fading light. Every tree looked the same, every path led nowhere. The forest was a maze, and no matter which direction we took, it felt like we were being led deeper into it. Then we heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps like the ones from the cabin. This time, they were closer. I froze, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. The sound was coming from behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. Just the trees, standing silent and still. But the footsteps continued. One step, then another, slow and heavy, like something was pacing just out of sight. "We need to go," I whispered urgently, pulling Sarah forward. We started moving faster, almost running again, but the sound didn't stop. It followed us, growing louder with each step we took. And then, without warning, the forest around us shifted. One moment, we were running through the trees, and the next we stumbled out into a clearing. It wasn't just any clearing. It was the same one where we had set up our camp. Our tent was still there, the remnants of our fire pit sitting in the middle. My heart sank. We had gone in circles. No matter how far we thought we'd gone, we had ended up right back where we started. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." I didn't have time to answer because that's when I saw it. The figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. It was watching us, motionless, but I knew it was the same thing we had seen in the cabin. It was wearing Jason's clothes, or at least what was left of them, but its face was wrong. Too pale, the skin pulled too tight over the bones, like it wasn't made to fit. It didn't move toward us, but I knew that if we didn't get out of there, it would. Whatever that thing was, it had been following us, leading us in circles, and now it was just waiting for us to make a mistake. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. I didn't know. Every part of me wanted to run, but I knew that wouldn't help. This thing had already proven it could trap us, lead us wherever it wanted. We couldn't outrun it. And then, almost as if it had heard my thoughts, the figure finally moved. It took one slow step forward, its empty eyes locked on us, And that's when I knew we were out of time. The figure stepped forward, its movement deliberate, slow, as if it knew there was no need to rush. The air around us felt heavy, thick with dread, like the forest itself was closing in. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, her breath quick and shallow. My own heart was hammering so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen in place, as if something was holding me there, forcing me to confront the thing that had been stalking us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and took a small step backward, pulling Sarah with me. "We have to move," I whispered, but my voice felt weak, barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, just outside the circle of light from the dying fire. Its face was still mostly hidden by the shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. Whatever it was, it had Jason's clothes, Jason's build, but the way it stood, the way it moved, it was wrong. The eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to absorb all the light around them. Sarah let out a small whimper, her grip tightening. "We can't outrun it," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "It's been following us this whole time." I knew she was right. Running hadn't helped us before. No matter how far we thought we had gone, it always led us back to this spot. It was like we were stuck in its game, and no matter how hard we tried, we were always just a step behind. But then something clicked in my head. The cabin, the strange symbols carved into the doorframe, the way the paths in the forest seemed to shift and twist. What if this thing wasn't just stalking us? What if it was controlling everything, keeping us trapped here? Maybe it wasn't chasing us to kill us, but to keep us lost, to wear us down until we had no fight left. "We need to stop running," I said, my voice low but firm. "That's what it wants. It wants us to keep running in circles." Sarah's eyes snapped to mine, confused and terrified. "What are you talking about? If we stay here, It's been playing with us," I interrupted, trying to make sense of the madness swirling in my head. "Every time we think we're getting away, we end up right back here. It's like it's controlling the forest, trapping us in some kind of loop. If we keep running, we'll just end up back here again." She shook her head, panic rising in her voice. "So what do we do? Just stand here and wait for it to kill us?" "No," I said, forcing myself to think clearly despite the terror gnawing at my insides. "We stop playing its game. We need to confront it." Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind, and honestly, I wasn't sure I hadn't. But something in my gut told me that running wasn't the answer anymore. This thing had been leading us around, making us afraid, feeding off our panic. It wanted us scared. It wanted us to run. I turned toward the figure, my legs shaking, but my mind set. "Stay behind me," I told Sarah, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Whatever happens, don't run. We face it together." Sarah hesitated for a moment, fear etched across her face. But then she nodded, her grip on my arm loosening just enough to let me step forward. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, waiting. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk toward it, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn and run. But I kept going, closing the distance between us. As I approached, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if it was curious, as if it hadn't expected me to come closer. Its dark, hollow eyes seemed to follow my every move, but it didn't advance. I stopped a few feet away, the air between us thick with tension. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound brave. "Why are you doing this?" The figure remained silent. For a moment, I thought maybe it couldn't speak. Maybe it was just a mindless thing sent to terrorize us. But then, slowly, it raised one arm, pointing back toward the forest behind it. I blinked, confused. "Well, what are you trying to show us?" It didn't answer, just kept pointing. I turned to look at Sarah, who was staring at the figure with wide, terrified eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice barely a whisper. Is it showing us the way out?" The realization hit me like a cold wave. It wasn't trying to kill us. It was leading us, testing us. All this time, it had been showing us the way out, but we'd been too scared, too caught up in our own panic to see it. I took a deep breath, my pulse still racing, and nodded. I think it is. Carefully, I stepped back, pulling Sarah with me, my eyes never leaving the figure. It remained still, its arm outstretched, pointing deeper into the woods. A path we hadn't seen before seemed to open up between the trees, a narrow trail bathed in the dim light of the moon. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. Without another word, we turned and started walking down the path, the figure's gaze heavy on our backs. The air around us seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting as we moved further away from the clearing. I didn't look back, afraid that if I did, the path would disappear and we'd be trapped all over again. The trees parted, and before I knew it, we were standing at the edge of the road where our car was parked, exactly where we had left it. My heart leaped with relief. Somehow, we had found our way out. We wasted no time getting into the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly, it took a few tries to get the engine started. But once the car roared to life, I didn't look back. We sped down the road, the dark, twisted trees shrinking in the rearview mirror until they were gone. Neither of us spoke the whole ride back. What could we say? There was no way to explain what had happened, no way to make sense of it. We didn't talk about Jason, about the thing we saw wearing his clothes, about the figure that had been guiding us. It wasn't until much later that I allowed myself to think about it, to realize the truth. Whatever had been in those woods wasn't human, and it had let us go. But why? Maybe it had been toying with us. Or maybe it had just wanted to see if we were strong enough to face it. I'll never know. But one thing is for sure, Jason wasn't coming back. And I'd never set foot in Miller's Creek again.